I have had supervisors call me to ask me what the optimal target language usage is for instructors.
Yeah.
Because they're using that as a metric to evaluate their instructors.
Yeah.
And I feel really uncomfortable. I can't provide a number because we don't know the number, right? So I feel really uncomfortable about that. And teachers, I've seen a lot of trauma in teachers around this issue.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Amanda Brown lets us in on the sometimes surprising results of her research into immersive and non-immersive language teaching.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. My co-host Sam, the LRC's media development manager, is stuck in a snowstorm, so he'll be back for next week's episode. I'm delighted to welcome Amanda Brown to the studio today. Dr. Brown is Associate Professor of Linguistics at Syracuse University. She is on campus as part of our monthly LRC Speaker Series and gave a talk titled Immersive versus Non-Immersive Language Teaching, Experimental Studies in English, French, and Arabic Classrooms. We will extend our conversation about the implications of her research for classroom language immersion on our podcast. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Amanda.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
And we are very delighted to have you here. So before we dive into our topic, can you tell us a little bit more about your background, your research, and your path with languages?
So I think I'll start with my path with languages because that's probably the one with the least information in it. So being a researcher in second language acquisition, people often ask me, oh, that's so wonderful. How many languages do you speak? And my canned answer to that is, well, I don't really speak anything other than English, but because of my research, I understand why I can't. So my field is, obviously we study, people who have successfully acquired second languages, but there are lots of factors that go into that. So that's what I happily use as an excuse.
Nice.
But I had a career as an English language teacher in Japan and China and the Netherlands and the UK and the US. And especially that experience abroad really led me to my interest in cross-linguistic influences.
Nice.
So my main research program, sort of basic scientific research, is bidirectional cross-linguistic influence. And really, the main part of that is looking at how the learning a second language affects your first language.
Yeah.
So I had experiences coming back from my time in Japan, returning to my home country, where I observed that my first language, English, had been affected by those experiences. And that was really interesting. So my research has gone into that area, looking at the effects of learning a second language on your first language in speech and gesture. And the work that I presented is a really applied extension of that. So I had looked at how bidirectional cross-linguistic influences can impact second language assessment. And then in this newer line of work, it's taking that to the language classroom. And so looking at multilingual approaches to second language learning. So that's where we are now. But I'm still interested in the basic scientific research program as well.
Sure. Nice. So in your talk on immersive versus non-immersive language teaching, you mentioned multi-competence and translanguaging, and that the goal of world language teaching and learning should be the development of really bi- or multilingual speakers who are proficient and flexible in the use of multiple languages. How can we achieve that?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. So this line of research is kind of promoting the idea that one way we might think about this is by not banning languages in our target language classroom. So say we're learning Japanese.
Yeah.
And conventional wisdom, mainstream language teaching emphasizes the input that learners receive and the interactions they're able to engage in and the output they can produce. With a focus, of course, understandably, on the target language input, output, and interaction. But in that enterprise, quite a lot of people have written now about the problems of trying to ban the first language in the second language classroom. So if we're trying to develop multilingualism, the idea of translanguaging is to recruit the full linguistic repertoire of one's language knowledge in the service of one's communicative goals. And so the line of research that I'm currently engaged in then will take teachers' professional judgments and students' sense of agency in language choices to recruit their full linguistic repertoire in the classroom. So that means they may not be engaging in target language production the whole time.
Yeah.
They may be using their first language or other languages that they know in addition to the target language and their first language.
That's interesting. In your talk, you provided some information about some of these experimental studies that you have conducted in English, French, and Arabic classrooms. Were there any differences between these three languages that you uncovered?
The most surprising thing was the lack of differences across the studies, which was really unexpected. So we did look at a total of 12 classrooms. 4 of them were French and Arabic classrooms, so 2 in French and 2 in Arabic, and the remainder were English classrooms. And so you're looking at foreign language and second language classrooms. You're looking at different levels of proficiency. You're looking at different teachers, different students. But primarily the same kind of quasi-experimental methodology used across the studies. And with regards to the learning outcomes, as measured by quizzes and kind of fairly standard course assignments, there didn't seem to be a difference in whether the teacher was trying to engage in a fully immersive pedagogy, i.e. really only using the target language and encouraging the students to do the same, or whether the teacher was strategically involving the first language or other languages that the students knew in his or her pedagogy. And in the case of English as a second language, the teacher is not the one who's using these other languages because they don't know the other languages. It's the students. But the teacher is giving the students the power to be agents in that choice. And in the foreign language, the teacher is really part of this enterprise. And so we measured to what extent the teacher was using each of the languages in the classroom. And all the learning outcomes, the graphs, as you saw in the talk, there's either no statistical difference between these two pedagogies in terms of learning outcomes, or there's a slight advantage for the non-immersive pedagogy, which is really quite surprising if you consider all the differences here. Foreign language, second language, across 3 different languages, across different teachers, across different proficiencies. That was the most surprising thing to me. When you do treatment control educational research, it's always risky because there are so many extraneous variables that could be contributing to your results. But when you've studied 12 language classrooms and they all kind of point to the same thing, then I think that's quite powerful.
Yeah. In the ESL classrooms, were they mostly immersive? So was English used almost 100% of the time, as opposed to the French and the Arabic classrooms where maybe English also crept in?
So traditionally, in the context in which we worked, yes, English was mandated in those programs. It was present on the syllabus. At some points, there had been penalties for non-English use in those English as a second language classrooms. And then when we initiated this classroom research for that non-immersive treatment group, for those non-immersive treatment groups, we basically removed those restrictions.
Okay.
So what we weren't able to do in those classrooms is record all of the classes. These were intact classes going on for credit at the universities. So we weren't recording the students. That would have been impossible from an IRB perspective. So we can't actually quantify how much non-English was being used, and we're relying on student self-reporting and teacher observations for the data from the English language classrooms. And according to that, yes, there was quite a bit. According to what the teachers were observing, the teachers were journaling after every single class.
Oh, wow.
For 4 months.
Wow.
That's a lot of journaling.
No kidding, yes.
Yeah, that's a lot of journaling. So those journals proved to be really important to demonstrate fidelity to condition.
Sure.
To show that, yes, the teacher in their pedagogy is trying to implement a non-immersive pedagogy for the treatment condition, or we can call this a multilingual pedagogy, or maybe even a translanguaging or translingual pedagogy. For the French and Arabic classrooms, all those classes were recorded, so we have a much more detailed record of the languages that were being used by the teachers and the students. So the data is slightly mixed across the different classroom contexts, but in general, we can say that there were, in the treatment conditions that we were implementing, a non-immersive pedagogy, and in the control conditions, an immersive pedagogy.
Got it. Very interesting. So, Amanda, you just mentioned multilingualism and translingualism. What's the difference between those two terms?
So this is quite a loaded question, and I have run into some difficulties, to be honest, in publishing these data and the terms that I'm using, because some of the terms can be quite loaded. So there is, we've had the terms code switching and code mixing.
Yep.
People writing on similar issues to what we're investigating have used code switching as a way to describe the types of treatments that we're initiating in our classrooms. Translanguaging is a more recent movement that is pedagogically oriented, but I've been to a number of large conferences and conventions in recent years, and translanguaging, there are clear definitions of what translanguaging is, and the definition I use is recruiting one's full linguistic repertoire to achieve one's communicative goals, especially in the education of emergent bilinguals. And this is a definition that I obtained from Ophelia Garcia, who's very close to us in New York State, so that's very helpful. But in publishing these data, I have come across reviewers who may object to my use of some of these terms in the context that I'm using them. So it's really hard to try to find less loaded terms to describe the studies that I've done. Yeah. And so for the moment, I'm going with immersive and non-immersive. Or monolingual and multilingual approaches. And when I say monolingual there, I mean using only the target language in the language classroom. And so these seem to be the least loaded terms, but interestingly, they're often misunderstood. So when I say monolingual, people don't think L2 second language monolingual. They think first language monolingual. So I have to be careful there too, and kind of reiterate what I mean by monolingual.
Yeah.
So terminology has proven a little complex.
Yep. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So what we hear, especially for the K-12 context and ACTFL, there is a push toward target language only, right? That we should use at least 90%, if not more, of the target language in our instruction. Is that something that you are a proponent of as well? when we're talking about immersive versus non-immersive classroom teaching, should we strive for complete immersion?
There's a really interesting difference between foreign language learning and English as a second language learning and approaches to pedagogy in this arena. So English as a second language learning, particularly here in New York State, is really taking a bilingual approach and a translanguaging approach, and that's really being promoted for content-based learning.
Yeah.
For foreign language learning, yes, there is still this notion that full immersion is best and as close to 100% is best. And of course, there are studies, stretching back decades that have shown that insufficient input and opportunities for production is going to hinder second language development. But I think the key question here is how much input is sufficient, right?
Yep.
And I don't think this 90% rule, I'm not sure we have empirical evidence to support that. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get at with the French and Arabic studies. So because those were lab studies, we can quantify how much target language was used by the teacher and the students. So one of the slides I showed in my talk showed that in one particular lesson, I don't recall the exact percentage, but it was something like the teacher used only 23% of Arabic in that lesson. And how did the students perform on that quiz? Well, they performed better than the students who received closer to 100% of Arabic in that class. So, part of the question this research is trying to answer is how much input is sufficient and optimal for language acquisition. And there won't be a magic number.
Oh, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
It's going to depend on individual differences between, among the learners, but also with the teacher, proficiency level, languages. So what I'm trying to do is take a first step here and open the doors for more research. I have had supervisors call me to ask me what the optimal target language usage is for instructors.
Yeah.
Because they're using that as a metric to evaluate their instructors. And I feel really uncomfortable. I can't provide a number because we don't know the number, right? So I feel really uncomfortable about that. And teachers, I've seen a lot of trauma in teachers around this issue, which is another area that I'd like to take my research into, looking at the trauma that teachers are experiencing. And that's already been reported in the literature where the negative professional consequences for teachers, the underreporting they do, about their use of non-target language in the language classroom. I certainly heard that from my own students. So what this data is trying to show is even if the teacher only used 23% of Arabic in one lesson, actually the learners did very well in their quizzes that day. So this is not the end of this research program. We have so much more research to do, but I'm hoping to suggest to the decision makers that it's okay to do this research. We're not hurting our learners. The learners are still meeting the goals of that lesson, however they are measured. And let's continue to work on this because there's not going to be a magic number. So let's figure out what are the factors that impact sufficient and optimal levels of second language input, and let's all work towards that understanding.
I also think that there is a difference between input and input, right? I mean, not all input is created equal.
Yes.
So only because we have 90% of target language use in the classroom, it doesn't mean that that's the input that our students actually need to advance in their proficiency. So that complicates matters too.
You are absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so the next stage of this research is more descriptive. We do have quite a bit of descriptive research already in looking at what teachers use each of the languages for, what they use the target language for, and what they use the first language for in the language classroom. And that's very valuable. But what we don't have is the relationship between what they're doing with the languages and what effect that has on learning. We don't have that key link. And that's clearly the next step that we need to take. So what kind of input in the second language is necessary and what kind of input in the first language can facilitate the process.
Yeah.
So we know that teachers use the first language for all kinds of functions. Does it help?
Yeah.
And in my own studies, I did leave this up to the teacher. So I relied on the teacher's professional judgment to use the non-target language, so the first language generally, when they felt it was appropriate, and then by extension, them giving their learners the agency to make those choices too. So as a researcher, I really didn't try to control that, but we can describe the kinds of decisions those practitioners made.
Well, I'm really glad that you're doing experimental studies. I remember many, many, many years ago in grad school, I did a project on teacher talk and the perception of teachers, how much target language they use versus English. And that was so interesting because everybody was basically telling me that the more experienced the teachers were, the more they were like, oh yeah, I'm totally only using the target language. And that was not the case. So it's,
So that is really interesting. That is another area I'd like to go in, but actually the opposite of that. So what I've encountered, and I can absolutely imagine that you're experienced teachers who feel safe in their jobs and very comfortable and probably very effective teachers. I can imagine that this could have been their assumption. But what I've also seen, I have had teachers come and ask me privately if I will come and observe their classes and tell them how much target language they use.
interesting,
Anecdotally thus far, and I would like to do a study on this, anecdotally thus far, they are underestimating how much target language they're using. So
Interesting.
I had one teacher tell me that they thought they were using about 50% target language. Turned out it was about 99. You can measure target language use in a variety of ways. You know, how many minutes the teacher is talking, how many words they're using. But roughly speaking, around 99.9% target language usage. And so they were so
That's crazy.
off on their own, on their self-perception, so off. So I think putting your story and my story together could make a really interesting story about how teachers are not always aware about their own language usage. And sometimes this can be a source of anxiety for them. So this teacher was really pleased to hear
I
that
bet.
they were.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Not that way. And then I believe went and told their supervisor and then much, much happier in their job.
Nice. Great. So what are some of the implications for both researchers and practitioners in regard to immersive versus non-immersive teaching and learning? What's your suggestion? Is there one thing that you can definitively say that teachers should or should not do?
Yeah, that is a huge question, and I don't bear this responsibility lightly. I don't want to kind of cop out and not make any recommendations for a practice, but I want to be very, very cautious at this point because there is so much work to be done.
Sure.
You've mentioned one excellent area for expansion here, and the idea that not all input is created equally. So what kinds of input are effective? What I would like to say to teachers and their employers is that effective teachers can make effective judgments around language usage in the classroom. And just because they may not be using the target language close to 100% of the time does not mean the learners aren't getting an effective learning experience. I also want to tell learners that, and their parents, and anybody else who will listen. Once this is less of a hot button issue, it opens the way for more research. So this is the research implication. There's so much more work to be done. But I do have to say, this research was not popular research. There's a reason I conducted some of my research in lab settings. So it's not popular research. It's hard to do. I am protected by the wonderful academic freedom to pursue even unpopular research that has to be done. And so what I'm trying to do here is break down some of the barriers and the myths, but myths that carry huge professional consequences for teachers, you know. And teachers have told me their stories. And it's heartbreaking, and the trauma that they have around this and the guilt that they feel, and this has been reported in the literature too. So the data is trying to reassure all these stakeholders in the learning process. Our goal is common. We're trying to make second language acquisition, second language learning and teaching the most effective it can be.
Yeah.
My perspective in this study is cutting off the first language doesn't help. And sometimes it might hurt a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's remove that worry and pursue more research in this area that really gives us a broader understanding of all the factors around target language usage in the language classroom that can impact optimal learning outcomes.
Yeah. What would you like to tell language teachers about immersive teaching?
That is a great question, because clearly that's the maybe biggest implication from the research. So first, teaching in the target language only is a highly sought after professional characteristic. So employers will recognize that, students will recognize that, students will remember teachers who did that. So for teachers and, for example, my students, for teachers in training, I do tell them it is important to make sure they are able to do that if asked, because employers may ask them. So once they are able to do that, then they may be able to start taking those professional judgment decisions based around the language that they're using in the classroom. So the first step is make sure you can teach in an immersive way and then start making decisions around effective language use. And watch this space. Let's see if more research is done in this area. Let's see how employers respond to the type of research that we're publishing, how students respond, how teachers respond, what additional research we can do in this area. I guess just keep watching this space.
Great. So where are some venues where we can read up more on this exciting and very important work that you are engaged in? Are some of your research findings already available for public consumption?
Yes. So one of the English as a second language studies is already out in TESOL Quarterly this year.
Wonderful.
Another one is under review in English, and the French and Arabic is in preparation right now, hopefully to be submitted this year. It is interesting that the work on ideological work on multilingual approaches to second language or foreign language education has been around for a while. But there's been a massive growth in the last couple of years of the number of researchers doing work on how teachers are using the first language in the second language classroom. And that's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. So there's lots of work emerging over the last couple of years. That's great. A lot of it is still descriptive, though. So maybe looking at how often teachers are doing this and for what purpose. But we're still missing that link to outcomes. So I'm still hoping that we can have, and I understand this kind of experimental work it is hard to do.
Yeah.
For lots of reasons it's hard to do. But I'm hoping that more of these types of studies will emerge.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Well, before we sign off, can you please share with us your favorite word in a language that you speak, that you have learned, are learning, want to learn? What is that favorite word of yours?
Oh, this is such a wonderful question. And quite easy, actually. So there's a word in Japanese. It's a verb. And the verb is gambaru. And it basically means, so I had to look it up on Google Translate at some point because I also use it in my classes here. So I had an intuitive understanding of what this word meant, but I'd never actually officially checked it on in any translation tool. So I did look it up at some point. And it was translated as to do one's best. But to me, this doesn't capture the essence of this word. So you can use it for yourself to describe your own actions, but you can also use it in imperative form to encourage others.
Oh, nice.
And that's how I've experience this word. So this word is often said with such passion and vigor that in my mental lexicon, this word means fight. And not sort of physical fighting, but just perseverance and keep fighting and keep going and do your best. But more than that, do your best with passion, with vigor. And I just love this word. Maybe I associate it with my experiences living in Japan, but I do on multiple occasions say that to my non-Japanese speaking students and then explain to them what I mean by that. And I think they get the sense. So it's a great word. Ganbatte. Ganbatte.
I like it. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Amanda.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Next week, we are getting ready for Thanksgiving with a special episode on gratitude. Hear from Cornell students, faculty, and staff about what they are thankful for. Until then, auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.